Hello and welcome back to another episode of How We Got Here. It has been a little too long since we've done this. I do want to apologize. I've been going through some things. Paul decided, he's going to get himself hurt, so he's been going through some things. So we've been a little bit delayed, but we do have a banger of an episode here for you. I'm Jay. We've got Paul here as the other host, and today we're going to talk about the media and how we got to where we are today. I think we both agree where we're at today is just it's
an absolute shit show. Let's call it like it is.
Yeah.
Right?
It's capture with the headlines.
Yeah,
is what it is. It's what it is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. See, Paul, you've got a lot of notes in front of you.
I do.
Where you want to start?
Well, and so as always, I did research about the past and media, and of course we're going to talk about written stuff first. But one of the things I got to tell you right out of the chute is things kind of just go around in circles because throughout history you get these ebbs and flows, but periods like today where the public doesn't have a whole lot of trust in what they're being told by any media outlet. That's not the first time this has happened, but we are at a crossroads, and I'm sure we'll get to that part later on in the discussion. But of course, when we talk about media, we're talking about news mostly, and that the first type of news was done by word of mouth, and that was simple. It was one person talking to another, and you even had the concept of the town criers, where people would stand in the squares and yell out the news and stuff like that. But when you look back at history, and this really doesn't come as a surprise. The Romans, of course, were way ahead of their time, and in 59 BC, they actually had a daily circular that was posted in Rome. They'd hang that thing throughout strategic points
on
in the
stone
city.
tablets.
Well, no, it was
papyrus.
It was it was written, and it was hung on the various parts around the city, and the people that could read would be kept up to date on the news and
on what was going on, right?
Yeah.
Not opinions,
right,
of what's going on, but if Amadeus wrote a new song, that obviously wasn't in those times, but it just was. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going on, because there wasn't. Obviously, there's not a need back in those days to get advertisers.
No, it was not so much financial as it was almost government sponsored, and in fact, as we go through time, we find out that Julius Caesar,
great man,
great guy, he distributed a daily political news and acts type of circular also. That was also distributed out through the colonies, so that everybody in the Roman colonies would get this, the daily. At least the leaders in those colonies would get this daily thing that started with Julius Caesar, and it was maintained throughout the extent of the empire. So I guess until like Constantinople fell in the 1400s, this was something that was done on a daily basis, which really kind of remarkable when you think about it. That the Romans could have, again, they were so organized, and maybe it shouldn't surprise us that they had this nailed down too. But
what page was Sudoku on?
What's that?
What page was Sudoku on?
That I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
And that, honestly, too, so there wasn't, they had to distribute that.
Right.
And it's not like it's...
And there would be a lag time, obviously, from the time it was created to the time you could get it out to the furthest colonies. But their road system was pretty amazing. And they could get this out and about pretty quick in just a few days' time. So, the news you're getting would not be, so outdated that it was worthless. It was actually, at the time, it was as up to date as it could get.
And Caesar, I mean, there's obviously going to be some political motivations behind that, to keep his flock, his people informed. It showed from his perspective, probably showed like, hey, I'm looking out for my people. I want them to know what's going on. I want them to know what to expect. What's going on? What are we doing? What's happened?
And it was political news.
Yes.
That they included in their circular.
Propaganda.
Oh, for sure. It's government, right? So
also, I say the media and propaganda, they go together like peanut butter and jelly.
In
But
most cases, yes.
but propaganda in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, it's just you're trying to sell your perspective and you're trying to use your angles to sell that perspective.
Yeah, I get, in terms of propaganda, I guess it's how far off the road of truth are we going to go? So, I mean, yeah, I mean, in terms of putting forward your best, your best foot or whatever, yeah, propaganda doesn't necessarily have to be horrible, but
most time it is.
most times it is.
Yeah.
So, and I got to give a shout out to China, because China during the Tang Dynasty, this is about 618 AD, so this is quite a while after the Romans got started, but they also prepared a court report that was sent out to government officials. And that, again, was done on a daily basis. Here's the crazy thing about that. That continued all the way up through 1911 when the Tang Dynasty ended. So it started with the Tang Dynasty, ended with the Kang Dynasty, but it went from 618 AD to 1911.
And for my superhero fans out there, Kang Dynasty is not the same as, the Marvel Comics Kang. Okay, this was an actual dynasty time period within the Chinese population. Do we know why? Like, so what? Why did China? Why did Julius? We know why Julius Caesar wanted to put out the political newspaper, kind of just to build his image and build himself. But what was the purpose of China doing these, court reports?
Well, again, this was only sent to the government officials. So you have to imagine that what they were doing was, hey, here's our policy, here's where we're at, here's where we're going, this is what we want you to do. That kind of thing. Keeping the other at the time the Chinese dynasty and the Chinese empire was very large. And so, yeah, you're just keeping everybody on the same page, probably more than anything.
Keep them in check.
Keep them in check. Sure.
Hey, listen, this is what we're
different
doing,
word, right?
If you ain't with us, you're against us. So here it is. So yeah, but when we kind of move forward, it was meant to inform,
right? Yeah,
right.
Yeah. What's the emperor doing? What is the emperor feels important?
And nobody gave a shit what he wore to a gala, right?
Right.
That wasn't news back then.
No, I doubt it would have been. Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody cared if he was, had a fling with one of his aides.
No, that's probably to be expected.
Yeah, I would think so. But that wasn't news back then. Obviously, when the emperor controls the news, that's not going to be in there anyway.
Right. So as we're speeding through this timeline, the thing that probably changed everything was in 1456 when Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press, and this is probably the single most important development in terms of mass circulation of news, because initially it was mostly Bibles and things and religious papers that were used up with the printing press, but what this also sparked was literacy rates to start going up big time. Yeah. And without the literacy rates going up, obviously you've got a ceiling in terms of, trying to make a commercial success out of anything. But once the printing press was developed and they could, start distributing Bibles throughout the cities, throughout the countries, stuff like that, other religious materials, these were all, and then it became government notices and things of that nature. That's when literacy rates really skyrocketed, relatively speaking. And then the demand really started coming for more stuff to read.
Yeah, because people, and this is an opinion of mine. Obviously, I don't know it to be true of fact, but I think people are born curious,
right?
Like, and also you developed with the invention of the printing press, and to be able to kind of mass distribute and mass produce, reading material. I think the curiosity in the human race, I think that's what helped us evolve, obviously, is our curiosity to move forward and move past it. They're going to want to learn how to read. Those who have the ability to, there's obviously, as far as literacy goes, we can probably get into other subjects about who was able to learn how to read and who was not. But there was a reason, in the Kang Dynasty and Julius Caesar, that those got distributed to, the governments and the higher, because those are the ones who actually were taught how to read.
Right.
I think literacy was used as a suppression tool. you know, if you don't know what's going on, you can't fight back.
Oh yeah, and it's kind of funny you mentioned that because, and we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead, but there's a lot. The governments when the first newspaper started to be printed, and we're talking about 1609 was the first regular news publication. That was a weekly paper that came out in Germany. All these initial type newspapers were immediately met with government resistance. Because when the government wasn't drafting what was going to be in them, they found problems with them. And the first, almost without fail, they'd hit them with restrictions, regulations, taxes, oftentimes drive them out of business before they really could get off the ground.
And this isn't, I mean, there's been attempts to in the United States, obviously, with that. But you're talking about other countries as well where, you don't have the freedom of speech and the, press. The government kind of would control what you can and can't say.
Right. And you had your first daily paper. The very first one for public consumption was the Daily Current. And that was in 1702, and that was in Great Britain. And, again, these newspapers were just absolutely, immediately the government teed off on them, on all of them. A funny story, the very first newspaper here in the United States, their first article that they published blasted the British government. This is before the Revolutionary War. They were shut down 4 days later.
Yeah, exactly. No. You can't be, and it's not right. Obviously, you don't want to suppress that, but you're playing devil's advocate here. With literacy rates going up, you can see the danger in distributing those materials, because in the end, that's also propaganda. Like, I've got this perspective. I've got this point of view. The British government sucks. I hate their guts. We should probably fight them.
Yeah.
The British government's they're not going to want that being distributed out there. So of course they're going to try and shut it down.
Well, and you had mentioned about opinion before. And so once newspapers got a foothold, and they got a foothold pretty quick, the demand for newspapers was insane everywhere, whether it was in continental Europe, whether it was in Great Britain, whether it was in the United States. Once newspapers were introduced, people couldn't get enough. And shortly after the newspapers came along, magazines came along. And typically the magazines, which were a little bit more, they wouldn't come out weekly and certainly not daily, but they would contain a lot of opinion articles. And so you had this double-headed, beast that the governments are trying to keep control of. You had the newspapers, you had the magazines, and the public was mad about them. They wanted to read them. They wanted, they exchange them. Everybody's trying to figure out, what's going on. And it was something that was really, really, caught on fast.
And for my 18 to 30-year-olds out there, a newspaper and a magazine are like picture Google, but on paper, but you don't get to choose. You don't get to search. You kind of just go buy it and you read it on a piece of paper. This is going to be a big hit with them. They're gonna really get this.
Yeah. So we were just talking about in the United States, and so in 1671, here's the mindset of the governors. You had the leader, the governor of Virginia. His name was William Berkeley. He claimed that free education and the free press led to disobedience, heresy, sex, S-E-C-T-S, not S-E-X.
Yeah, sex, like
sex, like a religious sect.
Yeah, like a religious sect.
Yeah, and libel, even against the best governments. And this is just like a broadside against education and information, And this guy's saying this is bad,
Yeah.
And if you're in the ruling class, of course it was.
Yes, yeah, because the more educated a person is, the more they're able to think for themselves, the less control you have over them. Bottom line. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong. I mean, I don't know about heresy, but
yeah,
but definitely the sex, S-E-C-T-S,
right?
Because people they're gonna get in different camps, right? If you put out an opinion article, there's gonna be people who agree with it, and people who don't. But I think personally, that's what made our country great, at least, is the ability to go out there and say, well, this is what this article said. Here's my opinion on it. And another person say, don't agree with that, and they're allowed to disagree, and that's completely fine. But especially in the 1600s, you didn't have that. You had the British government going, no, I don't agree with that. And you had other rulers saying that can't be in there. We can only put what I want in there because I rule this world.
Well, and I think you look at the history, especially European history, but also probably true in Asia and everywhere else. The ruling class always tried to keep the non-ruling class uneducated, because by keeping them uneducated, people don't know. If you don't know what you don't know, and people could not. They didn't know better if they can't read, if they can't write. They don't know what options they have. They don't know what is going on in other places around the world. I mean, literally, you're living in an isolated shell, and your little village is all you know.
Yeah.
And if you're a landowner, that's exactly what you want.
Absolutely, and that still goes on to this day.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
There's no. I don't think anybody out there will disagree with that statement. Is that the ruling class wants to keep. They want to keep the rule, and keep the non-ruling class down there. I mean, that's just it's human nature. It's not right, but if I've got all the power, I don't want to relinquish that. And I could understand the fear that the ruling class would have with kind of mass distribution of information.
Oh yeah, especially if it's negative information.
Yeah.
If you're reading about something that's negative about the government or negative about the person that's controlling the landowner in your countryside, or all of a sudden people start getting out the pitchforks and the axes and stuff like that.
Yeah, but it also does. You talked earlier about this is like what's going on today. This shit show that's been going on for a while, where you don't know what to believe. I mean that was going on back then too. Absolutely. Because you'd have people that would read this opinion letter and they'd believe it. But it would also sow distrust because other people, no, that's not true. That couldn't be true. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden we've got two different parties kind of going at it now. The big difference between back then and today, obviously, is it's just more widespread.
Yeah. I mean, we have information at our fingertips now that they did not have. But, I told you that story about the first paper here in the United States, in the colonies. That was in 1690. The first colonial news sheet, and that was shut down 4 days after it ran its article about the British. But once the cat was out of the bag, or the genie got out of the bottle, that was it. Over the next 75 years, newspapers and magazines absolutely proliferated here in what was then the British colonies, and many of it was pro and con. You had your loyalists, you had your people that did not want to be part of Britain anymore. And yeah, they were, like you said, I mean, they were taking their shots at each other, and literally before the Revolutionary War happened.
Could you imagine if Twitter existed back then?
Oh yeah, right. But they were literally discussing the upcoming military conflict. I mean, that what's the crazy part about this? I mean, you imagine the British having a really tight control on this stuff. They could not control it. And part of it was because a lot of these papers had wealthy backers, wealthy elite people that were maybe pro-revolution, that provided them cover, and so those people had influence with the authorities, even though they were not necessarily pro-British or whatever, and and so these papers got published.
So it was the media that started the Revolutionary War.
Well, they certainly got the word out.
Yeah. Well, because think just from a publication standpoint, you've got the colonies back then. You've got this little town here, this little town, 50 miles away. That might, in today's time, doesn't seem like a vast, vast area to spread. But 50 miles back then was a very long way to travel. But the point I'm trying to make is, you've got this person over here who thinks, man, I really hate the fucking British. They're controlling, they're taxing me, but they don't want to voice that opinion because they don't know if anybody else shares that opinion. And then you got this guy down here, 100 miles away who thinks the exact same thing. And now all of a sudden we've got who says, I really hate the British are taxing me. But I don't know if anybody else thinks that. And then you've got these publications, these articles, these newspapers, these flyers that are being distributed. And I can imagine somebody back then reading that and going, wait a minute, I'm not the only one.
Yeah. And you know what really threw gas on the fire? Businesses looked around and said, wow, everybody's reading these 4 and 5, because newspapers were only 4 and 5 pages long in those days. But
They weren't full of ads.
They weren't full of ads, but businesses realized very, very quickly, man, I'm going to put some ads in these papers to get people to learn about my business and what we're selling and, and promote the business. And that just kick-started, even another leg of massive growth because once the business revenue started coming into these papers and they started making some money, that really just kicked the doors open and you started seeing a proliferation of magazines and newspapers throughout the colonies.
So I mean, advertising has always been a thing, right?
Sure.
If anybody owns a business trying to make money, especially in a capitalistic society, they want to get the word out. But I just wonder who was the first guy, right? Who's the local baker, who's looking around and going, he's reading a newspaper, he's reading an article, he's reading that. I wonder if I can reach out to the publisher and be like, hey, if I give you, $20 or I don't know what time was, but $20 back then was a lot of money. But if you'll just put my face and my name in there.
Yeah. Let people know that I'm selling, bread for $1 a loaf or something, or penny or 10 cents a loaf or 5 cents.
And day old bread for a nickel, you know?
Right.
And just because here's why my brain goes is I'm sure it's happened with you where this podcast, for example, I told my wife I want to do a podcast. She's like, well, that's stupid. Nobody's going to listen to you. She didn't say that, but she was more concerned about the investment in time and things like that. But, and I can only imagine the baker's wife going, you're going to pay somebody money to do what?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Who's gonna come to our store just because you put an ad in the paper?
Just because you read it in the paper,
right?
And then
but once it was found out to be a successful mode of communication to the public about what you were trying to sell, whether it was bakeries or clothing or lumber or whatever it could be, man, it like I said, it was gasoline on the fire. This really jump started the newspaper and magazine industry in the United States.
And the baker's buying his wife a brand new carriage, going, see, I told you
That's right.
so. I think we'll get to this much later. But the introduction of advertisements into media publications
became the business model.
It became the business model, and it's also one of the reasons why I think there's so much distrust today, because today I don't think but it seems like advertisers today they care more about the clicks and the advertiser revenue than they care about getting the actual news out. It's about being first, not accurate.
Oh, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and like you said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But even back in this early phase, especially during the war, the
Revolutionary War,
you had several publishers that felt like they had a responsibility to be honest and trustworthy and to disseminate what they felt was the truth to the public. And you had other publishers that, were the exact opposite. So I mean, some things haven't changed, and that's one of them is that, you had your reputable newspapers, and you had, other newspapers that were not reputable. And
you had your New York Post and your New York Times.
Yeah, right. National Enquirer and New York Times, or even
yeah. But I think also that was one of the first times we start seeing obituaries.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And again, those were things that it's kind of crazy. I'm not one of those people like comb through obituaries, but some people really like to do that. It's kind of crazy, but
Yeah, not. I don't want to find out who died.
right. But
I don't want to find out I died. I can tell you that. I don't want to wake up dead.
So anyway, getting back to like the Revolutionary War, so you had this huge tug of war. I mean, there were newspapers, saying that people that were neutral and loyalists were basically traitors, and they should have their property confiscated. So I mean, you're getting really hot opinions, being published in some of these newspapers, and then some of the newspapers, were calling the colonists who were in revolution, we're calling them traitors.
And to compare that to today's times, if you like Trump,
yeah, you're a traitor.
You're a racist, or you're a Nazi. If you like Biden, you're a liberal cuck.
Yeah,
it's literally it's parallel.
Yeah, some things never change, I suppose, and maybe human nature is one of those things. And yeah, if someone's not on your side, there will always be somebody that takes that really heavy pot shot at them.
And I don't think people understand truly, like the. I really want to hit home how much that really meant back then. That they were actually, because I could imagine young kids or people today not understand. Well, wait, this is America. Everybody wanted it to be America. Everybody wanted it to be separate from Britain. No. There was actually a large number of loyalists who were born in America, but fought for the British.
Oh yeah, I mean, like in the French and Indian Wars. I mean, that was one of those things. People talk about like the Civil War, how you had Union. Robert E. Lee was actually offered the command of the Army of the Potomac, and decided to instead he would fight for his state. Well, you had similar situations, that happened in the Revolutionary War. I mean, you had people that grew up in the British system, grew up as British citizens, who had fought for the British, who had been, went up through the British military and felt very loyal about it. And again, they had these tough questions. Do I go with, even their neighbors are split. Their family. I mean, what happened in the Civil War happened in the Revolutionary War, where families were split, where communities were split. Yeah, the idea that everybody was in favor of revolution, it's not even remotely close to being accurate.
So to have your beliefs and your what you think is true called out in a newspaper as a traitor, you should be hung, you should have your property taken away, was a very, very serious accusation, and once again is going to sow distrust. And it showed it's one of the very early signs that we see in America of a politically leaning media outlet.
Yeah, and it also showed the power of the media. I mean, because
even back then,
yeah, because it brought people off the sidelines. There were people, like I said, neutrals, people that just like today, I don't care about politics type thing, and yeah, it brought these people off the sidelines because now they had to pick a side.
Yeah,
and what side are you on?
And a lot of it was in part. Well, I would say all of it was in part and due to the distribution of these newspapers.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is how people got their information. This is how they learned, who's leading the Continental Army, who's our leaders in this movement, and same with the British, with their controlled newspapers doing the exact opposite. These are the people who are traitors to the country, and yeah.
But there were also newspapers that were on the other side of it, right? Of if you aren't for the Brits, you're a traitor, essentially.
Oh yeah.
Now, that voice was the minority
in some states.
In some states,
yeah. I mean, like New York State was a a hotbed for the British. I mean, that New York State was where that was their home base basically.
And it was, and I would think that a lot of what would sway those people who were in the middle, let's say who lived in New York, didn't have a belief one way or the other, was the distribution of the media, was how the media portrayed what was going on. Right?
Oh, no question about it. Sorry, I had to take a drink, folks. And so
of water.
yeah, of water. So the media played an important role during the Revolutionary War, and it's kind of interesting what happened after the war, because after the war was over.
And for those who don't know, we won. America won.
That's right.
Okay.
And apparently, if you've ever watched some of the people that they ask on the street who fought in the Revolutionary War, that
I love those.
we gotta make that clear. That actually, we won that one, folks.
There's a reason you're not eating beans on toast.
Right. But a free press, and this goes back to our First Amendment, but a free press was seen as part of a free nation, and
which did not exist prior to the Revolutionary War. Didn't exist prior to their Constitution.
Right. I mean, we were talking earlier about how, governments would routinely just squash, newspapers left and right, just because they printed something that, was deemed to be not acceptable. But, after the Revolutionary War was over, there was a lot of, especially with the Bill of Rights and things like that, there was a spirit in this country, and people don't understand. Well, I shouldn't say people. Some people don't understand just how different the United States was from every other country that was basically in the world. I mean, everybody else was a kingdom, basically. Everybody else was a dictatorship. Everybody, except for the French, you'd had a revolution, but then, Napoleon came along and reimposed a dictatorship. I mean, so, I mean, the United States was a wild and crazy experiment. It was people from different backgrounds, different countries, different religions, and thrown all together and trying to make it work. It was, it was a grand experiment, and still is a grand experiment in that regards. But, a free press, now, everybody after the war was over kind of had this, okay, we have a model on how to build a new nation. And one of the cornerstones of that new nation was a free press. And what we take for granted, it's not you had to fight for it.
And that was a wild notion back then. The fact that you can print basically whatever you want without government imposition was a wild notion back then.
Oh yeah. And so the newspapers, after the war is over, of course, now, you're in peacetime, and the War of 1812 was obviously going to approach in a few years. When was that fought?
Yeah.
The War of 1812?
Yeah, what year was that?
I think 1812 might be.
I'll read the newspaper and find out. Don't worry.
But the press started expanding big time. And by 1835, I guess you would say you had what was your first modern newspaper, and that was the New York Herald. And they actually started assigning staff to cover regular beats. So, and these were, regular beats for all subjects. So, now you've got what's really kind of become a modern day newspaper by 1835, where, they actually would cover sports. They would actually cover, local news. They would cover foreign news. They would cover, like you said, the obituaries.
National news.
Yeah, all that stuff. And it was the funding that enabled them to do this, because the cost of news gathering began to increase rather exponentially, because you had to come up with stuff every day, right? But they could fund it because the public just had an insatiable appetite for news.
So and they had advertisers, and that proved to be a very successful business model for print. Is advertisers plus the public, they're going to pay for that paper, because that's the only way that they can get information. Essentially, there's no radio at that time. There's not even a radio, right? So that's literally the only way.
And telegraph was a few years off still.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and even then it was Morse code, right?
Right. Yeah.
Which isn't a fun way to learn anything.
You need someone to translate it, right?
Yeah, and write it down, and then guess what? You got a newspaper.
So interestingly enough, when the Civil War broke out, this is where the first war correspondence came in. Mm-hmm. Newspapers, and just like what we're seeing, nowadays, and all the great photographs that we've seen from the battlefields and stuff like that, all that was from war correspondents that were working for newspapers who were recording this history, and they would go to the battles. I mean, literally, they would be there perched, I'm sure somewhere behind the lines.
Yeah,
but reporting on the battles, and that was hot news. I mean, you had to get that had and that would be by train usually, to get it all the way back to New York or Washington or whatever, and it would be in the newspaper within a day or two, when a battle happened.
And those guys, they were, I mean, you're batshit crazy to be a war correspondent back then, or even today.
Yeah, but like you said back then, I mean, because not only are you dealing with the potential effects of battle, but a lot of people died from disease, from both armies.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you're a war correspondent and you're hanging around with these people, it probably wasn't. Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just me or not, but when I read some of the the articles around the Civil War from the war correspondents, and I compare it to what you read in today's paper, it just seemed elegant.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think they used a lot more flowery prose than what we have today. And we're going to get into this. There's a reason why there's a perceived decline in quality, and I'm sure we'll get to that here in a little bit.
Yeah,
yeah.
There's absolutely a reason for that, but I think it was elegant because that was the only way to receive that information. So it had to be detailed. It had to be flowery. It had to be something that somebody wanted to read. I mean, you already had them on the hook, but if you don't get them in the first couple sentences, there, well, this is boring. This is dumb. I'm not going to read this. But
and it's just like even with the newspapers when they reported about the Wild West. They did the same thing. They made these great heroes out of regular bandits, basically.
Yep.
But people just ate that stuff up. So I mean, and once people got the idea, and this is obviously post-Civil War, that there was a appetite for stories about the Wild West. I mean, then you got your stories about Wyatt Earp, and you got your stories about Bat Masterson and Jesse James, and all the crazy people that were out there, Wild Bill Hickok and stuff like that. And
yeah, so the creative writing, right? The immortalizing of these people started within the media, and taking what was a regular bank robbery, right, which was typically a bad thing, right, and writing about it in such a way that almost
glorified it.
Yeah. Because
Robin Hood.
Give the people what they want.
Yeah.
They understood that back then. Like, I've got to sell this paper. I've got to sell this. How can I get that done? Well, I'm going to make this a fantastic story.
Right. And oftentimes truth got totally bent.
Yeah.
or even discarded altogether.
Take some creative freedoms, essentially. So even back in the Wild Wild West days, right, we're seeing, kind of some, I'm just going to expand on this a little bit more than maybe it should be, or just stretch the truth a little bit, because it's better reading.
Yeah, it makes a better story.
Yeah, I got to sell this, man.
Right. So, and here's a funny one, because when I tell you this story, most people at home and you obviously, you're going to recognize this one. So the thing that really kicked off investigative journalism was back in, I believe it was in the 1870s. There was a famous doctor named Dr. David Livingstone who went missing in Africa. And the New York Daily Herald hired Henry Stanley to track this guy down. And because everyone, they didn't know where he went. He was very famous. And so what Stanley did was he sent in daily excerpts or bi-daily, every other day, excerpts about his trying to find Dr. Livingstone. And this became wildly popular in the New York Daily Herald. People were snapping these papers up to find out if he found Dr. Livingstone or not. And of course, we know the great line that when he found Dr. Livingstone and he walked up to him and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," right? The famous line. And this kicked off investigative journalism. This was like, if you have one event, this was it, because here's this reporter who is tasked. You get to the bottom of this, you find out where this guy is, find out what happened to him, and you let us know what happened. And and this was so wildly the public interest in this story was beyond the pale. And this kickstarted that form of journalism.
Yeah. So you see that, and so that's people have to know Dr. Livingston, I presume. That's
Right.
that's pretty.
That line's
common.
pretty famous, right?
I would think so.
Yeah.
And if you don't know it, I forgive you. but you're right. So you've, but also it wasn't meant to be. It was almost like a happy accident, right? This wasn't meant to be this start of investigative journalism.
Yeah.
This was meant, hey, I need you to find this guy. And the person looking for him kept writing in as to what he found. And it was being published. People ate it up.
Yep.
So what do we do as capitalists? Hey, people love this shit.
Yep.
Give them what they want. So you've got this start of the investigative journalism. And I don't know, I'm thinking about this as well because my daughter's going off to college. Could you imagine the kid who's going off to college? Mom, I'm going to go to school to be an investigative journalist. Well, there's no future in that. Why would you do that? That's nobody's going to want to read that. Nobody's going to want that. And here we are today, and that field alone, as far as investigative journalism, is a very, very large field within the media outlets.
It not as large as it used to be.
Yeah, but it is.
Yeah.
It was not anymore as of today or the past few years, given with the advent of social media and things like that, and everybody's their own investigative journalist. But it was a very viable career. It still is a viable career choice today.
Yeah, 1879, the University of Missouri actually offered the first 4-year course in journalism. Before that, you did it the old-fashioned way. You became like a cub reporter or an apprentice at a newspaper, and maybe
almost like the same with a blacksmith, right?
Right.
I knew somebody who did this. I'm going to work under you for free. I'll learn the tricks of the trade and work my way up.
So let's jump ahead now, like say at about 1900. So you've got this post-Civil War boom. It's country's at peace again. And you've got this, now journalism you got schools, the University of Columbia in New York, then followed up in the early 1900s with another school of journalism. And pretty soon schools of journalism began to flourish. But these major newspapers at the turn of the century, they were the only game in town. And they went from, I had told you earlier how they had wealthy backers that gave them cover. They didn't need those people anymore. They were the wealthy people. Your guys like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. I mean, these guys were as wealthy as just about anybody else out there.
And if the name Pulitzer sounds familiar,
it
should. There's something called the Pulitzer Prize.
Now, interestingly, both these guys, both Pulitzer and Hearst, realized that instead of being antagonistic to 50% of the population out there, let's try something novel. Let's include viewpoints from both sides in our newspapers.
That's unheard of today.
Yeah, it's unheard of today. But of course, what it did was it blew circulation, skyward one more time, because now instead of just one segment of the population reading your newspaper because the other side's pissed off and don't want to buy it, now both sides are buying the newspaper because you're publishing both viewpoints. I mean, this seems like common sense, like when you talk about it, gee, why wouldn't they have done this from the get-go? But as we were talking about earlier, newspapers and media and people, opinions matter, and you had to take a side in the Revolutionary War. You had to take a side in the War of 1812. You had to take a side in the Civil War. I mean, you really didn't have any wiggle room.
Yeah. So as a publisher, you printed to the side that you were on.
Right. Absolutely. And like I said, it seems like common sense now, but it took these guys like Hearst and Pulitzer to say, wait a minute, what if we include articles that are like relatively objective, put both sides' opinions in there, and let people make up their own minds? Well, that turned out to be a very popular
business model.
And it probably ushered in what I would say maybe the first golden era of journalism, in the sense that you actually people got away from just from the blatant dishonesty. I'm not going to suggest that there wasn't still a lot of bullcrap that was printed, but you had these major newspapers now, and of course the New York Times followed suit and stuff like that, where Hearst and Pulitzer were West Coast papers that actually expanded eastward, but you actually had major newspapers now saying, wait a minute, we got a responsibility to present it in an objective fashion where we've done good journalism, we've done the background work, and now we're going to put stories out that we're going to present the facts and let people say what they think.
They verified through sources.
They did. Yeah. It wasn't the unnamed sources that we so common today.
Yeah, well, the courts have protected that as far as sources go for media outlets and not being able to name them. But it's interesting, though, isn't it? How they actually cared.
Well, they cared, and they cared about the social society too, because it was actually the newspapers that forced the government to start to break up Standard Oil. It was newspaper articles that were talking about John Rockefeller.
And you're referring to the monopoly, the oligopolies.
Yeah. I mean, John Rockefeller, for people that don't know, he founded Standard Oil. And if John Rockefeller's fortune was put into today's dollars, he'd be the richest man on the planet, and it wouldn't even be close. And I forget what the number was, because I wasn't looking at this number, but at his peak, he controlled something like 7, 8, 9% of the United States GDP.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a mind-boggling. You think this guy almost controlled 10% of our whole economy. Yeah, I mean, this is one person. And
to put that in perspective, if that were somebody today buying stock in a company, they own 7 to 10% of a company.
Yeah.
Their voting power in that company would be significant.
Right. And this guy controlled those same numbers, but of the whole economy.
Yeah.
Andrew Carnegie wasn't much less rich than Rockefeller, but Rockefeller was the top of the pile, and the newspapers took him down. They broke up. Because Teddy Roosevelt was coming along at this time. The idea of the monopolies, because you had the rail barons, you had the steel barons, and you had the oil barons, and Rockefeller, of course, was the biggest target of all these guys, and the banking barons also. And the newspapers decided these guys got too much power. There's so much power concentrated in such a small group of people that this isn't right. And that's when it was called trust busting back in those days, when the government began to break up all these monopolies, and it was the newspapers that did this. I'm not sure that would happen today. I mean, you got Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. I'm not sure that could happen today.
You look back at history, right? Yeah. That's not on accident.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Because these newspapers they started posting and posting these articles about Rockefeller, about Standard Oil, mm-hmm. and really
raised public
awareness, because that's who runs the government. I mean, essentially, especially that's how it's supposed to be. Is the people are the government. So when you had the public at large pushing back from reading these newspaper articles, he controls 7 to 10% of the GDP. You've got a large group of people have more power than that, right? So the government essentially was forced to act.
Oh yeah, and of course, like politicians like Teddy Roosevelt, who was a sincere person in this regard, he carried the torch for this whole movement. I mean, he took breaking up these monopolies as being one of his top reasons to be in politics.
And think about it. I mean, media outlets doing good for the country.
They can, yeah,
Seems like a foreign concept now.
Well, it does, but we've had other points in our history, and we can get into this. But here's where we start getting into other media too. Radio came along in the 1920s.
Yep.
So now that started becoming a factor. Television, of course, came along in the 1930s, and during World War II, radio was probably the single most influential form of media. But radio and television still never supplanted the newspapers in terms of putting huge dents into their circulation and stuff like that, and putting huge dents into their advertising revenue. That would come later with more modern developments. But yeah,
and not too long ago, by the way. Not you say more modern developments, like it wasn't too long ago where that started to happen. You started to see the print start to fade.
Oh yeah. So I mean, in the middle of the 20th century. So we're talking about like in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
This is when you started getting, your modern news broadcast on television, and this is where, although the news was being disseminated on TV, newspapers weren't. They almost worked hand in hand with each other, but the network executives thought that the news here's where again you're going to say, wow, what a novel concept. They thought the news was a public service, and and I remember, and I'm sure Donna does too, that, and you might be maybe a little too young for this, but maybe not. But I mean, the 6:30 nightly news. I mean, you only had 3 networks growing up.
Yep.
And every one of them at 6:30 ran the nightly news, and the family would, I remember me and my mom watching it every night.
Oh yeah,
every night. Especially
growing up, I only had 2 channels.
Yeah, well, when I was a teenager, and when I was preteen, Vietnam was raging, and that obviously dominated the news. And,
a little past my time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
but so
I was more of a Desert Storm baby.
So you look at what the newspapers and the media did in the 1950s, like Edward Murrow. He's the one that, Joseph McCarthy did the whole persecution of alleged communists that were in Hollywood and in the government and all this kind of stuff, and basically ruined so many careers. It's not even funny, but this guy was out of control. He was destroying people's lives.
Who?
Joseph McCarthy, the senator.
The senator for
which state? That
well,
off the top of my head, I don't know.
He was out there.
He was a United States senator, and for people that don't know what he was doing, he was basically doing communist witch hunts during the 1950s, because this is when the Cold War had just really been kicked off after World War II, and of course Korea was stoked everybody's feelings about communism versus capitalism, and United States versus Russia and China, and McCarthy felt like our government was infiltrated by communist spies. He thought Hollywood was infiltrated by communist spies. And like I said, he did these hearings and would just destroy people's careers. There was a blacklist that went out in Hollywood where certain actors couldn't even get a job anymore. Guys that were popular, actresses that were popular. And, it was, the media brought them down. So, and reined him in and got this all to stop. So
but that's how it was distributed at first, was through the media.
Well, yeah. I mean, when these hearings first started,
television, yeah.
I mean, people were reporting on the hearings, but then, finally, you had journalists that say, well, wait, this is bullshit. I mean, he's accusing people of being communists or not, and he's destroying people's lives. And
I hate to say it, but man, that sounds so familiar.
Yeah, it's kind of getting there, isn't it? And so you had these heroes. You start moving into the 1960s, and you had, and I can't even think of anybody today that even remotely comes to the level of these people. But you had your Walter Cronkites, who was called the most trusted man in America.
Yeah, and if I don't care who you are. If you're over the age of 20, you got to know who Walter Cronkite is.
Yeah. And
or maybe not 20. You think 20 is too young?
I think he's the first person to ever drop an F-bomb on network television, by the way. The true
and
story.
There's no delay back then, so if he said it, it went out.
Yeah. But here's how when you look at the distrust that everybody has for the media today, and then you think about Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley or Chet Huntley or Barbara Walters or a young Britt Hume who's still out there. I mean, these guys were legends. These ladies too. They were legends. And when they reported the news, you didn't ask yourself, is this guy bullshitting me?
Yeah.
I mean, it was like, wow, this is actually what's going on, and there was a lot of faith and trust, and
a lot of it was due to just the perspective that the media outlets had was, we are a public service,
right? And what they did, they expanded. Like CBS was called the Tiffany Network at the time. They established foreign news bureaus all around the world. All the other the two other networks, all the other networks, two others.
ABC, NBC, CBS.
Right. They did the same thing. They emulated the same model. They put a lot of money into their newsroom. They put a lot of money into their documentary divisions. They put a lot of money into the foreign news divisions. I mean, they were hiring reporters. They were letting people work up stories, and they were letting investigative journalism run its path, not trying to rush things. And so you were actually getting quality reporting. And, when you think about some of the stories that were broke in the 1960s, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was totally fabricated by the U.S. government to get the U.S. actively involved in the Vietnam War, it was the media that let the public know, no, this is bullshit, the story that the government's telling you. And then you had the My Lai massacre, which I'll talk about this. Seymour Hersh broke that story. And there's an interesting story that Seymour Hersh just broke about a month and a half ago. He's still out there, still plugging away. But for people that don't know about the My Lai massacre, this was a massacre that was done in Vietnam. Unfortunately, American troops went on a rampage and took the lives of many, many innocent people. And the U.S. government tried to cover it up. It was the press that again exposed this and said, "This isn't who we are. That we can't be doing this, and we can't be covering this up." And it was basically the press that destroyed Lyndon Johnson's presidential run.
Yeah. But by reporting the truth.
By reporting the truth, by reporting some of the stuff that Lyndon Johnson had said and done, and some of the many things that. We could do a whole episode on Lyndon Johnson and what a piece of crap he was, but the guy was not a very nice person. Let's put it that way. And we've got the tape recordings to prove it. And,
oh yeah.
But the press took him down, and it wasn't just even a matter. Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat, but it was just only a few years after taking him down that they took down Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm. I am not a crook.
Yeah. I mean, the whole Watergate.
Who was a Republican.
Yeah. I mean, Watergate, you had Woodward and Bernstein from the Washington Post meeting with Deep Throat, who was the informant who busted the whole Watergate thing wide open. And so once again, you had our media playing.
I'd recommend going to watch that movie too, Watergate. They made a movie about it.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah. I lived through it.
Yeah. Well, I didn't. So
yeah. But I mean, and that was all we talked about at school in those days. I mean, when those are crazy times, really, when you think about it. Because I remember my parents owned a restaurant in the late '60s and early '70s in my hometown, and literally as a little kid, I was like 8, 9, 10 years old during that era. Yeah, I remember people getting into wild arguments about Vietnam, like just right in the middle of the restaurant. One table starts screaming at another table, and you're like, "Wow, this is really getting crazy," But even Watergate, when it happened, it was at 72, 73. I mean, I remember us talking about it in school. I mean, teachers, talking about it in social studies class and stuff.
And there wasn't, I don't know, I didn't live through it, but was there this air of, is this true?
No. Yeah. And that's where I think you and I are both heading with this conversation. I mean, you turn on the news and they tell you what was going on, and you took it to the bank. You said, okay, that's what's happening, you know?
Yeah.
And there was this trust. And again, we talked about an earlier golden age, you know, when they broke up all those monopolies. The 60s and 70s are probably the last golden age. And part of the reason for that was corporate America invaded network news.
Oh, yeah, they got a stranglehold.
In 1985, the Lowe's Corporation, which was at the time, it was a hotel chain and theater concern. You know, they had a theater chain and hotel chains. They bought CBS, the Tiffany network. And they immediately said, well, wait a minute. How come our news division doesn't make money like our entertainment division does? Okay. Because it was still being run as a public service up until this point in time. Well, when Lowe's got their hands on it, they immediately got rid of the foreign news bureaus. They huge job, you know, cuts in the newsroom. They cut back on the documentaries. They cut back on everything. I mean, they trimmed the fat and, you know, took some of the muscle with it.
Yeah.
And
a lot of the muscle.
A lot of the muscle. And absolutely just,
I mean, they destroyed it.
They destroyed it. They excoriated it. And what happened is ABC and NBC were also bought by big conglomerates. And the exact same thing happened in their organizations. All the, you know, the serious serious reporters lost their jobs. The newsrooms were decimated. The foreign news outlets were, you know, done. All, you know, everyone was relying on the AP and stuff like that, and just, you know, which is the AP, in fact, was started by 6 New York newspapers to disseminate news that they all shared. And so that's what they basically did on network television. Instead of everyone going out and hunting for their own jobs and hunting for their own stories and digging deep into stories, they all started relying on the same stuff, and everybody started spitting out the same generic kind of stuff. And, you know,
which also a lot of parallels to today.
Yeah. And it's crazy because in some of the research that I did, like the decline in the network newsrooms in the 80s and 90s was sudden, it was quick, and it was devastating.
And it was all meant to, so that their goal wasn't to get rid of news, but to make it profitable.
Yeah. 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 They didn't go along the same lines that we're a public service. You know, that we're providing the American public with a needed service that informed them and educated them and let them, you know, you didn't have the opinion, you know, I don't care what you watch on TV anymore, if it's MSNBC, if it's Fox, if it's CNN, whatever, they're all opinion. It's all, you know,
yeah.
You're not getting anything objective. Everything has got a tilt. Everything's got a slant. And that was not necessarily the case. Of course, I think some opinion always bleeds through.
There's always going to be some bias.
Right. But there was a notion, there was a measure of professionalism in journalism up until the 80s that does not exist now.
For the most part. I mean, there's going to be some high integrity journalists, but they're also poor.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And they don't have a job at any of the networks that we, you know, that we're going to, you know, maybe mention or something like that. I mean,
yeah. Well, because like I said, they like Lowe's and these other big conglomerates started focusing more on advertisers. That's that they go, the more people that watch us, the more money we can get for advertisers. How do we get people to watch us?
Well, so that was the first shoe to drop, was these big corporations taking over the networks. But then the next shoe to drop was cable television, because now you're splintering the market.
Yeah,
you know, and even
everybody's fighting for market share,
right? And advertisers realized, oh, wait a minute, this cable channel is specifically targeting this person or this demographic, and that's the demographic for our product. So we're going to start advertising there. And of course, cable advertising was much cheaper than network advertising, because, you know, networks say, oh, well, you're getting, you know, advertising over the whole nation if you advertise on our network. Well, the cable channel said, well, you know, now we're going to shoot to this segment. We might, if you were TBS in the old days, it was just in the Atlanta area before it got bigger. WGN, same thing, Chicago, and then they became
And for the people in our local area, like WB64, that'd be the local cable channel,
right. And so they could target local markets and local, maybe, where their businesses had their strongholds, and for a lot less expense than the networks, they could advertise on the cable channels, and one another step of deterioration in terms of the ad revenues, and this is when the newspapers started to really take hits too, because when the internet came along, you had like Craigslist, cars.com, stuff like this, where, if people wanted to buy a car, they could go to those sites, and they didn't have to buy a newspaper anymore and tediously look through the classifieds and not find a car they want, or the color they want, or the model year they want, because they know they could go to Craigslist and they'll find it.
Because a lot of the newspapers did get their revenue from personals.
Oh yeah, classifieds were giant.
I'm not sorry, I said personals. I was like, look, I'm classifieds. Personals, like I'm looking for a date, right? I think that's what personals is.
Well, I knew what you meant.
Yeah. But classifieds, yeah.
Yeah, classifieds were the main source of revenue for newspapers. So you got this double hit going on all at the same time, and which kind of leads us to where we are today.
But from the 90s on, you start to see
massive revenue shift
and this degradation in integrity of reporting.
Mm-hmm. Well, what the internet brought us was this 24-hour news cycle, and so there's been a lot of discussion about it among the journalism community, because now the emphasis is to rush the story, to run it as fast as you can to beat everybody else to the punch, and what you end up getting is you get a lot of poorly shoddy journalism,
half-baked stories,
stories that are inaccurate, stories that are undeveloped, stories that don't have the players right, and we see the confusion that causes even today. I mean, it's how many times does somebody run a story, and you find out 2 or 3 days later it was just complete bullshit?
Exactly. Well, I mean, I can give you some real world examples, but you also mentioned splintering too with the advent of cable television, but the internet and social media. I mean, that splintered the media outlets even further, is because now I think you've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter are considered media outlets. People go to those sources to get their news. They shouldn't, but a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. So that's why you start to see this huge rush to be first, is because if I got it first, that's where the advertisers are going to be. That's where I'm going to get my ratings. I'm going to make a bunch of money. But I think we're going to start seeing a shift, because these outlets, like the big media outlets, they're now being held accountable for their fuck ups. Think about the Covington Catholic incident.
Oh, that's a big one,
right?
Yeah, and you had everybody jump on those kids.
Jump on one kid in particular too. Right. The kid that it was first reported that essentially that this boy and this group went and bothered these Native Americans, were being racist, and even went up to them and stood in their face. That's how it was reported at first. But then, let's give it some time to bake. You start to see the actual story come out, and it's not even like, it could have been perceived. It was the exact opposite of what happened.
It wasn't even up to debate. What had happened. It was when you actually learned the facts. And Don and I knew. It's crazy because we actually knew two of the kids. That were in the picture, and one of the kids comes from a biracial family, and we're watching them be, these kids are being called racist. We're like, oh my God, there's like a biracial family like right in the middle of this group, and we know that those kids aren't racist. It was a crazy time, and
because it was a rush to be first. Now, that media outlet had to pay a significant sum of money.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, I think.
In settlements,
and I think there's still ongoing litigation. Not all the people that were sued, I don't think have settled. I might be wrong about that, but I
Yeah,
think that's accurate.
I don't know, but now the rush to be first is costing these outlets money. But the issue is while we might these media outlets might be telling us that, okay, we're being safer, we're verifying our sources, the damage has already been done.
Oh yeah, and there's still people to this day that, use the Covington Catholic example. There's still people to this day that'll tell you that those kids are racist, and that those kids went after the guy, the Native American, and nothing could be further from the truth.
And because that's another huge downside to the splintering is because it is so splintered, you can only seek your confirmation bias. And this is what I believe.
Right.
I'm going to go find a reputable, in quotes, news source that will confirm what it is I believe.
See, but here's the problem that, you just used the magic words, reputable news source, because we have a death spiral right now in the newsrooms. If you're a newspaper, if you're a network news channel, what you've got less and less ad revenue coming in. That means you got to do more job cuts. When you do more job cuts, the quality of your product goes down. And so people pay less attention to the crap product that you're putting up on a television screen or in your newspaper. And the newspapers try to transition to the internet, and a couple of them, like maybe the New York Times and maybe the Wall Street Journal, have found a way to monetize the internet a little bit. But for most newspapers in this country, the internet's been a disaster.
Yeah, because I can guarantee you this. Most people out there who click on a Wall Street Journal article, they'll read it and they'll say, click here to read the full article.
Yeah.
And they'll click it and they'll say, pay this, and they go X, click right out of it for the most part.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're always trying to get you to sign up for a subscription.
Yeah. So it's just interesting because it's how we have to get information. That we've already established that is an important aspect, especially, I mean, I think in a global culture, but also in American culture, we are a people that like to have information, but we also want and need accurate information. So how do we get that trust back?
Well, so we already mentioned earlier, at one point in time, our media, broke big stories about Vietnam, about Watergate, Iran-Contra, if you remember in the 80s. That was a big one also. And even going into the 90s, the Monica Lewinsky scandal was covered by the media. And I'm not so sure today if the Monica Lewinsky scandal happened today, that would even be covered on 90% of the channels.
I don't think it would.
Yeah, you wouldn't even hear that it happened. Just like
that's not the hot topic now.
Well, just like Hunter Biden's laptop. I mean, it was a crazy stat after the last election. They said that something like 40% of people who voted for Joe Biden didn't even know about the laptop, and that's and it's crazy because there were certain networks that never even mentioned its existence or said it was a Russian hoax. You had these 51 former intelligence agents that said, oh, it's all Russian, blah, blah, blah. And there's still people that say that, oh, it's Russian, blah, blah, blah. But we know now that the FBI has had this thing since 2019, and they know it's legit. And you would think there would be
That'd be a huge story.
There would be some investigative journalists out there just chomping at the bit, to get at this. But
there is, but he's not funded, or she's not funded.
Yeah, and so you got so many stories out there. It's like Jeffrey Epstein's client list. Well, jeepers! I mean, if I was an investigative reporter, I'd be wanting to get a hold of that freaking client list. That is a story. To put those names out there. I mean, everybody wants to know those names. I mean, that's why. If you were the only network that had that story, don't tell me your ratings going to go through the roof. If you were just like, bleeding out a few names every night for about,
I think that's
for
the
about
big
a month,
problem. I think that's the big problem is they're not worried about the ratings going through the roof. They're worrying about advertisers pulling because there's no
good point.
There's no consensus amongst the media outlets to have good reporting. So if this media outlet says, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to get that contact list, or we're going to talk about Biden's laptop. And this reporter, this is over here is talking about, some shooting that happened. Well, they're not worried about what the ratings are going to be. They're worried about, well, if I post a story, advertisers might pull their money from me. It might go over here to what's the hot topic being talked about by everybody.
Okay, so who's the number one advertiser on all the cable networks right now? It's Big Pharma.
Yep.
So what just got disclosed like 3 or 4 days ago? Anderson Cooper has received over $12 million from Pfizer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does anybody in their right mind to think that Anderson Cooper is going to shit on Pfizer at all?
And
ever,
what did Pfizer just come? What just happened with Pfizer in 2020, 2021? What was that? What was that vaccine?
Yeah, vaccine thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we won't get into that, but it's the advertisers is you've got the majority of the people are talking about this. So if you as an outlet go off and you talk about something else that probably has more significant importance in our culture and in our society, they're too afraid to, because they'll lose revenue. It doesn't matter how many people watch them. Nobody's going to advertise with them. And that's the big problem that I see.
And I'm not so naive to believe that, going back to the beginning of time, in terms of advertising, first in newspapers and on radio, television, cable, and internet, I'm sure if you had a major heavy advertiser, you thought twice about maybe running a story critical of that advertiser. I mean,
even back then, yeah.
Yeah. But,
if Ovaltine tastes like shit,
yeah,
and you're a reporter and Ovaltine's your advertiser, you're not going to say Ovaltine tastes like shit.
you just may not talk about Ovaltine.
Yeah.
But we're in a situation right now where the advertisers are probably, it's a tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a situation here where we just had confirmation. This is, sometimes you think about the craziness of this. For the last 3 or 4 years now, we've had military pilots with video talking about UFOs that they personally witnessed. We've had the American government a couple of years ago, issued a statement that they were in possession of materials that were not made by man. And now you just had this whistleblower whose former commander, he's from the intelligence agencies, said that this guy's reputation is beyond reproach, just came out and said that we are in possession of multiple UFOs and that many other nations in the world are also in possession of these vehicles, and everyone's reverse engineering this stuff, trying to get the head start on everybody else. When I was a kid, if you had confirmation that UFOs are real, I can't imagine a bigger story. I mean, that would have been just crazy.
That's it.
And no one's even talking about it. And you're going like, this really seems really bizarre. I mean, since the 1950s, everyone's been like searching for UFOs. Now we have confirmation that they exist, and nobody's even discussing it. It's like,
That's the thing. I don't know the fix is.
I mean, someone put the kibosh on that story. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's such a big story. It's like, how is nobody talking about? Nobody is talking about this.
It's the deep pockets. I mean, it's just what it is. It's just the deep pockets, because the advertisers tell you as the society what you want, but then they also tell the media what to put out, because this is what I'm telling you that you want. So it's kind of like just this never-ending infinity ring of just bullshit.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody should get their fucking news from Facebook, but I've seen stuff on Instagram and Facebook that nobody's reporting on. Then you do your research on it, it's actually true. Like, I mean, even with the UFO stuff, like whether you believe in UFOs or not, there are people who are reputable out there who say that they exist. And that's not being reported on. Instead, what's being reported on is whatever this mass shooting that just happened. I mean, or that's mainly what you're seeing right now on a lot of the major media outlets is
they have
mass shootings.
They have an agenda.
Yes, get guns out of
whatever network you're even talking about. Because they've become left-wing and right-wing networks now.
Yeah.
But they've all got an agenda, and they all push that story. And if something doesn't align with their agenda, very few, if any of them, actually, run the story. I'll give you a perfect example. CNN did a town hall. What was that? 3-4 weeks ago, and former President Trump was on the town hall, and they basically attempted to ambush him, and he ended up having a pretty good town hall, and the crowd seemed like it was pretty receptive to him. And the head of CNN just resigned. His name's Chris Leaked or something like that. He just resigned. I mean, he took so much flack from inside the walls of CNN. Like, what are we doing giving this guy, a forum? Why are we putting him on TV? We allowed him to look good, and I don't think a news organization should, if you're CNN or you're Fox or you're MSNBC and you're running a town hall and you're inviting the presidential candidates, because they also invited Nikki Haley on, and they're inviting, of course, some. I don't know if they're going to run the Democrats or not, but that's a different story altogether, because I think the DNC saying they're not going to even have debates for the Democratic party. So that's kind of weird, but
yeah.
But in any event, I mean, we got a presidential election coming up, and news organizations should be putting town halls up and putting all the candidates on stage.
On both sides.
On both sides, and letting them answer questions from the crowd, which is what, I find fascinating. That's what I like about the town halls. It's not the reporters so much that are, asking the questions. It's people in the crowd, getting a microphone and saying, asking what's on their mind. And I find that to be a fascinating forum, and I think it's really informative, because you really find out what the American people are what they consider to be important. But yeah, I mean, why would a news organization get so worked up about the fact that some guy that they invited on
looked good?
I mean, it's present the case, and let the chips fall where they may. That's what a news organization should do.
So I think we as an American society are past the point where we can trust media, and any type of media, because it's not just the news networks. It's also your social media accounts, your even your non-traditional media like Ben Shapiro. He's media, right? He's got an agenda. He's reporting his news. So I think as a society, we're past the point where we can just trust what the media is telling us. So I think the fix for that is not to change the media, but to change how we perceive it, how we intake it. Do not, if you see something, do not assume it's true. Trust it, sure, but verify the accuracy of the information. But also have an open mind. Don't go automatically looking for closed-minded. For example, like Ben Shapiro, he's one of the big things going right now is he's the whole trans thing. So if you're anti-trans, you're going to go watch Ben Shapiro because he has what you believe and what you perceive to be true. But what I'm telling you to do is, yes, okay, if that's your thoughts, if that's your perception, and that's the media that you are consuming, don't just go consume Ben Shapiro. Look at RuPaul, right? Look at different perceptions, and just be open-minded as to what you want to believe. Now, the trans thing, that's a whole. Maybe that was probably a bad example, because that's not true or false. It's more of a belief.
Or like verification, what you talked about. It's like, okay, maybe he makes a statement on one of his, and I don't listen to Ben Shapiro, but maybe he makes a statement about some fact, and you find that statement to be a little bit odd or something, that you should fact check that.
Absolutely. Always fact check.
You know?
So I think we're past the point where we can change media. We need to change how we intake it and how we interact with each other, because what we are letting media divide us as a culture.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And what you said is 100% accurate, because one of the things I noticed in my research is that over 50% of the American public does not trust the media. And that, you know, think about how far we have fallen from the 50s and 60s and 70s, when the American public relied on the media to provide them with the information. You know, if you'd have run that same poll in the 1960s, you probably would have had 75% of the people said they trusted, you know, the people that were on nightly news, regardless of the network. You know, maybe the number would even be higher. But now you got more than half of the American public don't believe what they're being told, and there's a reason for that too. I mean, you know, oftentimes we're just not being told the truth, and I mean, that's reality.
We're being told a version of the truth, is how I like to put it. We're being told what your version, what your one side of the truth happens to be, based upon facts that you're able to pull to help support your argument as a media outlet. So, which is why you have to look at both sides to come to your own conclusion, but not only be willing to share that conclusion, but also if you are, as a media personality or whatever, are going to, you know, share that with somebody, make sure you're telling them both sides. But they're not, and they're not going to. So I'm tired of trying to say they should, because they're not going to, because they care too much about their revenue. They care too much about advertising. So just as a person who wants information, get it from both sides, because we're letting them win. We're letting the media win, essentially.
So in the 60s and 70s, if you had a situation that like you have right now in the Democratic Party, you got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is going to challenge President Biden, and he's getting 20 to 25% of the vote now. He started at 0. He's up to 20 to 25%, you know, in the polls. Not, you know, I shouldn't say vote. He's polling at 20 or 25%. But then I'm watching one of the heads of the DNC saying, "There's, you know, Joe Biden's ahead of the Democratic Party. We're not going to have any debates." I'm thinking to myself, that's not right.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, you know, when Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter for you know, and they went at it hammer and tong all the way up to the 1980 election, when, you know, Carter ended up beating Teddy Kennedy and then losing to Reagan in the general election. But I mean, where's this precedent that you're not going to have debates, you know, just because some guy's a sitting president? I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, and it's not being covered.
No. So anyway, yeah, so we got this upcoming presidential election, and you got to wonder, what role is the media going to play in this? Because what we saw in 2020, rightly or wrongly, well, I'm going to tell you, I think this is wrong. We know now that the Democratic Party was in communication with Facebook, obviously Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, also with Twitter, the other social media platforms, to deplatform Republican voices. Now
this is not an opinion, by the way. This is a fact. And because we're sitting here telling you that you should fact check.
Yeah, fact check.
Go on and fact check it. That it's 100% true.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not a Donald Trump fan. I don't like the guy.
Yep.
But that is 100% true.
Yeah. There's no Trump stickers in our house. So yeah. But I mean, it's a simple matter of fact that, you know, they coordinated with a political party to not, and it wasn't just Donald Trump that got deplatformed. It was Republican commentators. It was Republican congressmen. It was a wide range of voices that got silenced in the lead up to the election. And it's really, man, you know, I would never want that to happen to a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian or whatever affiliation you have, let all the voices be heard. That's what the American people need. And so how do we make an assurance that we don't have a repeat of this?
We can't. That's the problem. We can't. There is no way. I think we are so far gone in terms of that it is now up to us as the American people to just say, fuck you. Okay, thanks for telling me that. I'm going to go do my own research. I'm going to find. You can no longer passively take in media. I don't think that's my output. That's my take. Is you can't passively. If you really want to know, if you really want to educate yourself, you have to be active. You have to be active in it and look for the information, because it is out there. It's just at what level are you going to see it?
I mean, we've had. It's one thing to even be silenced, but you also have this situation where when somebody doesn't do the party line, not only do they get silenced, but they get attacked. And I'll give you a perfect example is Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is prior to COVID, was the most famous cardiologist in the world. He was the most published cardiologist in the world. If you had asked anybody in the field of cardiology who is the best known cardiologist in the world, they would have said Peter McCullough. And not only is he a cardiologist, but he was running a hospital down in Texas. And he was treating sick COVID patients and had developed a protocol. And, because he was not on board with some of the treatments that were being put forward by the government, not only did he lose his job at his hospital, not only, his license was threatened, he ended up being sued by multiple medical associations, and it almost drove him into bankruptcy. I mean, to hear him talk about this story, he went from sitting on top of the world and treated thousands of patients with COVID successfully, by the way. And because he wasn't towing the party line, had his career almost ruined. Same could be said for Dr. Robert Malone.
Well, like Dr. McCullough too. We look back, hindsight.
He was right.
He was right.
I mean, let's talk about it. I mean, he was the one that warned everybody about myocarditis right out of the chute. Said, "Wait a minute, this vaccine is causing myocarditis in young people. It's causing myocarditis in middle-aged people, people that should not be having heart problems or having heart problems, and it's from this thing." Well, that was the kiss of death for McCullough. Dr. Robert Malone, who invented mRNA technology and controls many of the patents of it, when he was critical of the vaccine, his LinkedIn file, which was long and had all these tributes on it and it had all these nice things about him, it was just taken straight down. His LinkedIn profile was just taken straight down. His Wikipedia page was altered. He used to say that he was the inventor of mRNA technology, and then it said, he was controversially, claims that he invented mRNA technology, and then, then you saw all these counter articles coming out saying, this guy's a nut, he's a crazy. Same thing with McCullough, by the way, too. They said the same thing about him. He was nuts and he was crazy and stuff like that. I don't, of course, Microsoft owns LinkedIn. And you got these major corporations
just Bill Gates. What did he contribute a lot of money to?
Right. He pushed the vaccine, right? And so you've got, and LinkedIn is part of the modern,
media.
Wikipedia is part of the modern media. Everybody, when I do research on our stuff, I always go to Wikipedia. That's one of my sources. Not all of it, but I always see what's there, and maybe it leads me into something else. But how do we stop this? How do we stop the silencing of people. How do we stop careers from getting ruined? I mean, we're at a bad spot when it comes to the media. And
Well, I think just like with anything, it's slow changes over time, is what it is. And I think this is attributable to almost any topic of debate, whether it's race, religion, politics. Is people want to say, well, that's no longer a problem. Why are we still talking about it? Even as it gets better, and the issue is because there are constantly going to be problems that need to be solved with media, with race, with whatever, with race relations, with politics, with guns, with anything out there. And it's small incremental changes over time. And the only way that happens is people continue to fight. People continue to discuss it, because at some point in time, the small little change you make today will make it easier for the next voice to make another small change, which will make it easier for the next voice to make a small change. I mean, think about an easy one is race relations, right? We didn't go overnight from slavery to where we're at today. That didn't happen in the course of a week. It took a lot of small incremental changes and a lot of smaller voices continuing to speak out over a long period of time to get to where we're at today. That's how we change it with the media, is people like us having these discussions.
In regards to race relations, and we're talking about the media, I would say they've contributed to damage race relations. You know, I would agree with your statement in the sense that over time, the relationship between the races, had gotten better and better and better and better. And I always think of Martin Luther King's line that, about being judged by the content in your character and not the color of your skin. And it's, it's one of the best lines ever. It's one that I impacted me, But we get the exact opposite from this now. Again, talking about
we get the exact opposite
our
perception.
I mean, but we got people going on various media platforms now, and they're not even talking about race, and they're getting called a racist.
Yeah,
it's insane. And this is all for clicks. It's all for
clicks.
It's for ratings. It's for clicks. It's like, if I'm and they invite these guests on the shows that are crazy, and
so we can't.
It's
they're going to do what they're going to do now. We have to fight against it to make those small changes, to start holding these people accountable. Like, they're starting to have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars out now when they tell an inaccurate story. And as far as race relations go, I think the media is trying to push perception. They're trying to push some type of issue by only reporting on certain aspects. But the reality of the situation, in my opinion, as far as my experience goes, is we're in a pretty good spot from a race standpoint, despite what the media is trying to push on us. And as long as we push back,
I think 95% of the people out there don't really give a shit what color somebody is if they're a cool person. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
as long as you're not a rapist or a murderer, I don't care.
Yeah, the first thing I think when I
meet
Steelers somebody, fan. Or Steelers fan. But I mean, the first thing I think about, when I meet somebody is not the color of their skin. It's like, this guy seems pretty nice, or this lady seems pretty nice. I mean, that's.
And yet the media is pushing it in our face every day.
Oh, every day.
And that's where the pushback starts to happen. Is as long as we start to push back, we do have a word. We do have a voice as a people, because advertisers only have so much power as long as people are buying their product. Ratings only matter when people are not watching, because when they're watching, the great ratings are up. We're going to talk about whatever you want, but people stop watching and start doing their own research. There's going to be a change. There's going to be a shift. Like I said, we could talk probably all night about how the media is trying to fuck us. But I don't think they are trying to fuck us. I think what they're trying to do is make a buck, and their greed is putting blinders on exactly what they're doing to the American people who rely on them for their information. And they're lost. They've forgotten where they've come from. They've forgotten what their purpose was.
Well, how powerful are these powers that be? How about the fact that we just basically recently had the person with the single highest cable news ratings fired from his job?
Good old Tucker?
Good old Tucker. And not because he reported something inaccurately, and not because he libeled somebody or anything like that. I mean, they basically, somebody decided, we're sick and tired of this guy, and we want him off the air.
Small incremental changes. We just got to keep having the discussion. As long as we keep having the discussions as an American people,
yeah,
it'll have to get better over time. That history has shown that.
Well, hopefully this is a low water mark. Yeah, honestly, I do think the fact that the majority of people don't trust the media right now will hopefully lead to somebody saying, hey, we need to regain this trust. And the way we regain the trust is by reporting the news objectively and not being opinionated, but letting people, make up their own mind as to what they hear and see.
But trust and watch are two different things, right? You can not trust the media, but if you're watching, they don't give a shit if you trust them or not.
Yeah. You
got to stop watching. My wife doesn't trust me not to eat the Oreo cookies she got upstairs, but she ain't hiding them from me. So you got to find a way to not trust and not watch, not intake. Do your own research. Go on. I mean, you've got the internet at your fingertips. That's how you take back the power.
Definitely.
I think it's been a good discussion.
Right. And a needed one. And hopefully other people, we can, people at home talk about everybody else.
Hit
talk
us up
with your friends. Send us some messages too.
How we got here, jp@gmail.com. That's HWGOTHERE, jp@gmail.com. Until next time, sooner rather than later, thank you. We'll see you again.